All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And of course, today is a mock draft Monday where we'll be talking about Georgia edge rusher Travon Walker's potential fit in Atlanta. But we'll start things off talking about Matt Ryan restructuring his contract, what it means for the Falcons, and what it means for his future as well.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans. And, of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. In today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So today is a mock draft Monday where we will be examining Kyle Krabs of the Draft Network, as well as the host of Locked On Dolphins' most recent mock draft, where he had the Falcons selecting Georgia edge rusher Travon Walker. But we won't get into that until a little bit later in today's episode, because first we got to talk about the big news over the weekend that ruined my Friday night out here being social and whatnot. And of course, the Falcons have to go and restructure Matt Ryan's contract and whatnot. So I had to give these takes on that, and we'll get into that on today's episode. So the Falcons did restructure Matt Ryan on Friday. They saved about $12 million against this year's salary cap, which now puts them about $16 million under the cap, thanks to the Calvin Ridley suspension, saving them $11 million previously. The Falcons did a fairly unique way of restructuring Matt Ryan's contract by adding some void years to his deal rather than doing the sort of typical max restructure. They saved roughly about 15, or they took about $15 million off of Matt Ryan's potential cap hit and spread it over 5 years, taking the $7.5 million roster bonus that he was due, I believe, on March 19th, and then taking about $7.5 million of his $16.25 million base salary and using that $15 million to spread over 5 years, right? They added 3 voidable years to his contract. Matt Ryan had been previously signed through the 2023 season, so he had 2 years left on his contract this year and next year. But adding those 3 voidable years, which means that Matt Ryan is not under contract for those years, but you can use those years as way of spreading around bonus money, which is what the Falcons wind up did, converting that roster bonus as well as that base salary into prorated signing bonus money. So that's going to save them about $12 million this year. It's going to put $12 million on their dead cap in the future years that will be now spread over 4 years instead of just one. And now Matt Ryan's cap hit goes from $48.7 million, which was historically high for the NFL, now to $36.7 million. This, of course, guarantees that Matt Ryan will be back as the Falcons starter in 2022, which we have long suspected would be the case. There was, again, that sliver of a chance that the Falcons would move on from Matt Ryan if someone was to basically, back up the Brinks truck in terms of draft picks for him, which we knew was very, very unlikely. But certainly this move now means that the Falcons are out of the trade market for Matt Ryan, at least until the calendar year of 2023. Now his cap hit in 2023 will be $46.7 million. We don't know if that's historically high, but since it's almost a $48.7 million that he had this year, I'm going to assume again that we will see tweets a year from now saying, oh, Matt Ryan has the highest cap hit in NFL history in 2023. So what this restructure does, again, guarantees that Matt Ryan will be here in 2022, doesn't guarantee his future because the Falcons could still trade Matt Ryan next offseason, move on from him and incur a dead cap hit of $27.6 million, which is roughly $19 million in cap savings if they were to trade Matt Ryan next March. And as I've said many, many times on this podcast, basically over the last 6 or so months, and especially over the last 3 months, that whether Matt Ryan is back in Atlanta in 2023 is heavily dependent, in my humble opinion, on what happens this upcoming season with Matt Ryan and as well as the team. If he performs well, if the team performs well, and what that exactly looks like, obviously is a matter of debate, depending on what your subjective opinion on that. I sort of see that as an improving their win-loss record and or really being a legit playoff team, and Matt Ryan performing like a top 10 to 12 quarterback from a production standpoint. If that happens, then I think the Falcons will have the conversation again next offseason. The same conversation they're having this offseason is, are you going to extend him? Are you going to restructure him? Or are you going to trade him? And if he has that well of a season, I think the Falcons will certainly talk about possible extension or potentially another restructure. And if he doesn't have that type of season, then I think trade certainly becomes a viable option for the team. So we'll just sort of see how that goes. I think the reason why the Falcons did it this way, rather than just doing a straight up max restructure and adding voidable years, which pretty much would have saved him a similar amount, if not more, is because I think the Falcons also want to have the door open for a later restructure in the year. Again, I don't know exactly how it works and how often you can restructure these sort of contracts and the clauses in the contracts, but with these sort of simple restructures, you don't necessarily need to negotiate with the player, I think, how it works. So I think the Falcons later this summer potentially could restructure Matt Ryan's contract again and save themselves around $6 million by taking his $8.75 million base salary that he currently has after this first restructure and lowering it to the veteran minimum, which is $1.12 million, and taking that $7.6 million difference, spread that over the 5 years, including those 3 voidable years, and that would save them about $6.1 million against the salary cap. And that's something I think the Falcons can use sort of as an emergency fund if they need to sign their rookies or if they need to create cap space before the season in order to make some potential roster moves or whatever the case may be. So I think that's something that the Falcons have on the back burner, and that's why they chose to only take part of his base salary right now because they're just going to play it by ear as far as that goes. And, what's interesting about this Matt Ryan restructure is because we had the report from Steve Weish of NFL Network at the end of February, basically saying that this was going to be a potential, code red, he called it, last resort sort of option for the Falcons because they didn't want to sort of, move money around. And I was skeptical at the time of that, largely due to the fact that I was mostly skeptical that it only made sense that you wouldn't touch Matt Ryan's contract if you were able to free up money in other ways. And Steve Weish put out their contract extensions for Jake Matthews and Grady Jarrett, which still technically remain on the table. We'll talk about that a little bit later in today's episode. But I was skeptical that the Falcons would get extensions done with those guys before the league year would start, just because of the size of those contracts usually take like months and months of negotiating. And so I was kind of skeptical of the idea that the Falcons wouldn't touch Matt Ryan's contract, but they did wind up doing that. And, I've seen a lot of people sort of upset about the Matt Ryan restructure. I don't really get that. I guess if you're upset with the general direction of the team and the idea that the Falcons aren't trading Matt Ryan and trying to maximize his trade value and instead of keeping him for another year, I guess I could get that. But again, I think you've known for a while that was going to happen. So like, it feels like fresh anger just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like if you're just generally angry about the whole direction of the team beginning last year, then I get that. But like being mad specifically about this move, it just kind of feels like this is the direction that the team has been headed now for several months. And then the other weird thing, because I'm petty, is how many people are sort of like, taking victory laps about this, and particularly the folks that were spent the last several months insisting that Matt Ryan was going to get extended this offseason, and this is not an extension because they did not add any more years to Matt Ryan's contract. Just because there are voidable years tacked onto the end of the contract does not mean that Matt Ryan is under contract for those years. And it's weird because like back in December, it was the week 14 all 22 review, December 14th episode that we did. I basically spent the first 15 minutes of that episode breaking down why it made no sense for the Falcons to extend Matt Ryan and why it only made really sense for the Falcons to restructure Matt Ryan. this off season, and basically in my mentions as well as comments on various videos for the last 3 months, so many fans have been insisting that the Falcons were going to extend Matt Ryan, and like seeing some of those people be like, "See, I told you they were going to do this with Matt Ryan." I'm like, "No, that's not what you told me. You told me they were going to extend him. I told you 3 months ago that they were going to restructure him, and you insisted to me that I was wrong." And so that's weird. But again, I'm petty. That's just me being petty, of course. So we'll just sort of see what comes of this in the future. Extension as well as restructure still on the table for next year. But right now, to me, again, been saying this for 6 months now, that I think it's likely that 2022 is going to be like Matt Ryan's last year in Atlanta. But we'll just sort of have to see. Again, I think this regime is kind of doing the thing that I talked about them doing 9 months ago. And it sounds judgy when I say it, but like I just think they're kind of making it up as they go. They're kicking that can down the road before they make a long-term decision. And like that was the thing I said 9 months ago. Like they're just kind of making things up as they go. And like for a lot of people, that's like a negative thing. But like the thing I've noticed over watching football and whatnot and talking about football for 20 years is I think most teams are doing that. It's not like the Rams were like 3 years ago when they paid Jared Goff, like, oh yeah, we're gonna get 3 years out of Jared Goff and then we're gonna make a trade for Matt Stafford. Like it was an opportunity last year to trade for Matt Stafford. They jumped at that opportunity. Every team is kind of making it up as they go. It's just when it works out for those teams, we sit here and we go, oh, they were geniuses and they figured it out. Like certain teams are better at making it up as they go, but they're all kind of flying by the seat of the pants or using the force or however the metaphor or term that you want to use for that. But like that's kind of how it is in the NFL. And time will tell if the Falcons regime in terms of them making it up as they go looks good. And again, that's going to be determined by their success on the football field and how many wins they get and making the playoffs and whatnot. And we'll be like, oh, they were geniuses. They knew what they were doing the entire time if they start winning games. And if they don't, then we'll be like, oh, they were terrible. And like that's how it goes. And I continue to insist that. So we'll see how it goes with this team. That's part of the reason why I'm not up in arms, because ultimately their success will be judged on the field, right? How many wins you get, how many points you score, all those various things. So we'll just have to wait and see how that turns out. I always remain skeptical of all things Atlanta Falcons because I've been a Falcon fan for 30 years and they have never delivered in 3 decades on, that potential. So I sit here and go like, why is it going to start now? All of a sudden I've been waiting 30 years. I'll probably be waiting another 30 years, but that's just how I work. I know other people view things differently, but maybe things will start turning around for this team in the future based off of who they draft in round 1. And we'll talk about one potential option for them in Georgia's Travon Walker, a player that is rising up draft boards as of late. And we'll get into sort of what he could potentially bring to the table for the Falcons or any team that winds up picking him early in this draft as we continue today's mock draft Monday. But before we get there, guys, of course, it's not just things going on in the city of Atlanta for the Falcons. There's things going on in the city of Atlanta for other teams, including those Atlanta Braves. Why not check out the Locked On Braves podcast, where you can find, the latest going on with my cousin Freddie and whatnot as we get geared up for this upcoming 2022 MLB season. Of course, you can find Locked On Braves free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So, guys, it is that time of year where March Madness descends upon us, and Built Bar, while not necessarily unveiling a new tournament to determine what is the best flavor, Coconut Brownie Chunk won that tournament last year, but they still have a variety of different and new flavors that can add to your madness this month, including the white chocolate shamrock flavor. Go try that if you're a big fan of mint and chocolate or mint and white chocolate. In this case, you can find that flavor available at built.com. You can find that flavor in addition to other flavors like the tried and trues like cookies and cream, salted caramel, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond. And, the reason why you want to try all these flavors of Built Bar is because Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. But unlike a candy bar, Built Bars not only taste good, but they're also good for you because Built Bars are high in protein, high in fiber, but low in sugar, low in calories, low in carbs. And that's the great way to get in on this March Madness frenzy so that you can eat healthy and feel great as you descend upon, as you're fueling, staying up late night, filling out these brackets and whatnot. So you can get your favorite flavor of Built Bar by heading over to built.com. And when you do, use the promo code LOCK15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKed15 for 15% off at built.com. So we're looking at Kyle Krabs' most recent mock draft on the draftnetwork.com, where he had the Falcons selecting Georgia edge rusher Travon Walker at the 8th overall selection. We've talked briefly about Walker on this podcast previously, particularly this past week, where we were talking about some of the combine risers and fallers at the edge rusher position. We talked quite a bit about Travon Walker and his ability to potentially solidify his status as a top 10 edge in this draft class, top 10 draft selection, due to how impressive his combine was. And if you just need a refresher on that, he measured in at 6'5", 272 pounds with 35.5-inch arms and a 7-foot wingspan. That puts him in the 90th percentile in both of those length categories. And that wingspan is actually a few inches longer, or at least a fraction of an inch longer than Adio Gandeji and Kyle Pitts. So again, he has those sort of pterodactyl arms that the Falcons were very attracted to a year ago in their draft. He ran a 4.5 140. He had jumps that were both in like the 70th and 80th percentile in terms of vertical and broad jumps. And his 3-cone of 6'8" was in the 93rd percentile for edge rushers, according to mockdraftable.com. And we've discussed on previous episodes going into the combine, when looking at some of these combine tests, that the 3-cone compared to some of these other drills for pass rushers, when you look at the first round pass rushers, edge rushers taking over the last 12 years, the one that was most predictive of NFL sack production was that 3-cone. So, the fact that, Walker's had one of the best 3-cones ever, is certainly something that is very intriguing for him. But despite those sort of physical tools, Walker's kind of a polarizing prospect, because when you watch him on film, you kind of see a raw, unrefined player, and you see the talent, you see the athleticism, but you don't see a guy that really knows how to use it and maximize it. And some of that is owed to how Georgia used him in their scheme. They would often kick him inside. According to PFF, 20% of his snaps this past year came on the interior, where Georgia would like to use him, as well as their underclassman Jalen Carter, as their interior D tackles on passing downs, instead of guys like Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt. And so, I think the biggest knock on Walker when you watch his film is that he has the tools, he has the power, he has the length, he has the athleticism, he has the bend, all these various things that you'll see flashes of, but he doesn't really rush with a plan, right? He's just kind of just out there. You're just trying to win with pure physical skill set for the most part. And so any team that drafts him is essentially, you can argue his floor is going to be a little bit lower than a lot of other edge rushers that you're typically taking this high in the draft. And you're going to have to teach him how to rush with the plan and how to maximize those skill set. And, it's the idea of like, okay, he spent a lot of time playing 5 technique at Georgia, kicked inside on passing downs. What you want to do in the NFL is get him on the outside, get him at edge, and let him use that length, that bend, and that physicality to really attack tackles, their outside shoulder, and just bully guys on the outside. And that's really where his upside lies. And when you compare him to other players that were similarly, in terms of their build or whatever, some of them were very close to Walker, but others were not. But were also sort of guys that were in the same mold. Danielle Hunter's one, Rashawn Gary's another one. Ziggy Ansah is a guy that, from a physical standpoint, height, weight, length standpoint, Walker compares very favorably to, but is actually a little bit more explosive, a little bit more bendy, at least based off of the combine drills. And Ziggy Ansah was coming out as a top 5 pick out of BYU back in 2013. And like Hunter's interesting because Hunter at LSU had 1.5 sacks his final year at LSU, and often as a 250-pound edge was asked to basically play a 5 technique role, and never really got an opportunity to sort of pin his ears back and get after the quarterback as an edge rusher. And then we saw him go to Minnesota, get coached up, and he's become one of the better pass rushers in the NFL. Rashawn Gary was a super unrefined player at Michigan that was just living off of his power and whatnot, and not really rushing with a plan, and played a lot of interior as well at Michigan. Was moved to purely as a 3-4 outside linebacker in that Packer scheme, and has become a very productive player the last 3 years in Green Bay, coming off a 9.5 sack season this past year. His final year at Michigan, he had 3.5 sacks. And Gary's a guy that has won primarily due to the being able to overwhelm tackles with his power. And Ziggy Ansah was just like a athletic freak and whatnot. And by his third year in the NFL was having 14 and a half sacks and was a Pro Bowler, and then injuries kind of derailed his career over the last 5 or 6 years at that point in time. But these are sort of three players that are similar to Walker that have gone into the NFL as sort of these unrefined, developmental athletes, and these sort of freaks, and have gotten that development and turned into really good NFL players. And so, if you're buying Travon Walker stock, you're looking at those three guys as like good examples of players that have turned into really good players. And so, we'll just sort of have to see where Walker stock winds up getting him. We talked about it 2 mock draft Mondays ago when we talked about Kayvon Thibodeau, how sort of it seems like folks around the NFL seem to think Walker is going to get drafted higher than Kayvon Thibodeau. And I've seen recent mocks since the combine having Walker go as early as number 2 to the Lions in this draft. And you look at teams picking ahead of the Falcons, like the Texans, the Jets, the Giants, all teams that are pass rusher needy, anywhere as high as 2 as well as 7 to the Giants makes a lot of sense. You maybe even throw Carolina on that list, picking at number 6. If they lose Hassan Reddick this offseason in free agency, maybe they'll be looking for a pass rusher, although right now it seems like quarterback and offensive line are bigger issues for them moving forward. So, it seems very likely that Walker is going to be a top 8 selection, certainly a top 10 selection. And, if you go back to what we said with Jordan Reed of ESPN, when he came on the podcast this past week, he mentioned Travon Walker as a really great fit for the Falcons, in large part due to his belief that Dean Pease wants bigger, more physical edge rushers up front on the D line. And so, Walker does fit that bill as a guy that could be 275 pounds, but can play in a variety of ways and be utilized in a variety. If you want him to line up purely as a 3-4 edge rusher or outside linebacker that's going to set the edge and drop into coverage, he can do that, right? He moves extremely well for a guy his size. You can line him up in a 5 technique, which was what he prominently did at Georgia. You can kick him inside, certainly on passing downs, and put him as a 3 technique as well. So he offers a lot of versatility, a lot of dynamism when it comes to how he can be deployed, and the Falcons can kind of mix and match him. And he could, if developed, be this sort of matchup nightmare that can line up anywhere on the defensive line and create mismatches. And that's something that could be extremely valuable for a defensive coordinator like Dean Pease in the future, or any defensive coordinator in the future. So there's a lot of reasons to like Travon Walker, but he does probably arguably have a lower floor than some of these other pass rushers available at the top of the draft. But then I think he arguably has a higher ceiling than some of these other guys potentially have, just because of how freaky an athlete he is in terms of basically having a build comparable to a Myles Garrett or a Ziggy Ansah, but having athleticism, beyond some of those guys. Now, maybe not Myles Garrett, but you know what I'm saying. So that's the intriguing part of Travon Walker, and whether he gets there is really, I think, dependent on coaching and where he goes and all these various things. And, for me as a Falcon fan who's watched this team fail to sort of develop pass rushers in-house for the last 20 years, at least edge rushers, if you remove Grady Jarrett from the conversation and Jonathan Babineau from the conversation, you got to go back to Patrick Kearney before the Falcons really hit on an edge rusher back in 1999. You look at it a little skeptically, like, okay, here we go with another developmental edge rusher. That hasn't bode particularly well for the Falcons over the last 20 years. But at some point, you're going to have to take a swing at one of these guys. And, if you have confidence that this is going to be the coaching staff that's going to be able to sort of break that cycle, then by all means, you're not going to hear me complain about the Falcons taking Travon Walker, as I often say on this podcast, when it comes specifically to the pass rush. Beggars cannot be choosers. So swing big, swing hard for a guy like Travon Walker makes a ton of sense. But I certainly understand why other people are like, he's a little scary. He's a little boom bust to me, and I would much rather a safer player at that position. I think certainly there's opportunities for the Falcons to find a safer player at that pick. And again, maybe other teams will be much more intrigued by Walker's potential and take him higher. And so he's off the board by the time it gets to pick 8. But I certainly think if he's on the board, it would not shock me at all. And I would probably bet a good amount of money that he would be the Falcons pick at 8 overall. So that's going to do it for us, guys, on Mock Draft Monday. We still have a little bit more odds and ends that we can talk about with some of the recent, free agent rumors surrounding some of the big Falcons free agents as we head into this sort of big week of free agency with the tampering period. And we'll get into some of those odds and ends as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On NFL podcast, which you can find free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And of course, Locked On NFL is a great second listen after you've made Locked On Falcons your first listen. And of course, Locked On NFL is also free and available on YouTube, and they're covering all the big storylines that are going to be coming over this week. We already got a bunch of, blockbuster moves and blockbuster trades this past week. Maybe we'll get a few more. So stay tuned to the Locked On NFL podcast, free and available on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. So it is that time of year now that we're in the month of March, and college basketball's tournament is finally upon us. And if you want to find the latest odds, contests, and player props, of course, betonline.net is the number one source for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And of course, it's not just basketball that you can bet on. You can, of course, find other sports like golf and hockey. In a couple of months, we got baseball coming. And of course, we're only a few weeks away, less than 2 months away from the NFL draft. And betonline.net has some of the best draft props out there. So head on over to the website today at betonline.net. Use your mobile device to sign up and learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So let's get into some of these odds and ends, particularly, as I'm recording this Sunday afternoon, what's sort of been the latest on some of these Falcon free agents. There was a report Sunday morning from Jeremy Fowler of ESPN saying that the Falcons are working to get Foye Oluokun re-signed, but his contract could be north of $10 million a year. And we talked about before how several reports, when we did our last Free Agent Friday, we talked briefly about how Foye Oluokun had often been mentioned as a player that was going to get paid a lot more money than people expected, which, was implied that he was going to get more than $10 million a year this offseason, potentially something, approaching $12 or more million a year. And so it's interesting to see the Falcons working to try to get him despite that high price tag. It seems like all things are quiet on the Cordarrelle Patterson front. I haven't really heard much about him the last couple of days. You can take that, any way that you want, that, they're quietly working towards a contract, or maybe it means that teams, that he's looking at other options. I would probably go in the former direction, thinking that it probably means that they're working hard on getting a deal done. If other teams were sort of in the hunt, you would think we would hear a lot more rumors about that, because you also heard a rumor Sunday about Russell Gage, where Jordan Schultz put out there that, the Lions are a team that's looking at Russell Gage as one of their potential number twos that they could sign this offseason to tag team with Amon-Ra St. Brown. So we'll just sort of have to see, again, in the next 72 hours as we get towards the league year starting on Wednesday, and free agency officially kicks off at 4 p.m. Eastern time on Wednesday. We know the legal tampering period kicks off Monday at noon Eastern time. And so that's when we will probably start to hear some of these players get signed. And so time will tell, how the next 72 hours go. If it was me, and sort of my stance has been for the last several days and weeks, if I was ranking the three, highest profile Falcon free agents in terms of their likelihood of returning from most likely to least likely, I would go Patterson, then Gage, then Foye Oluokun. And mostly that was due to my expectation that you could rank those guys in that order from the, smallest contract to the biggest contract. None of them are going to get small contracts, relatively speaking. But in terms of the most affordable option, I have felt like the Falcons, Cordarrelle Patterson probably be given the cheapest in terms of, per year in guaranteed money, followed by Gage, and then followed by Oluokun. But, maybe that's a wrong assessment given some of these recent reports. And because, the Falcons value, Foye Oluokun being the quarterback of the defense, and it makes, to me, perfect sense in terms of who's the most valuable of these three players, that you can make the case, at least in a vacuum, that Foye Oluokun is the most valuable, so that he could potentially be the priority. So we'll just sort of see how that goes. We'll probably see a couple more cuts. We'll possibly see a couple more restructures as far as cuts go. Tyler Davidson, almost certainly like 99.99 infinite 9% chance that he's going to get cut. And that will save the Falcons a little shy of $4 million against the salary cap. We'll have to sort of see what happens with Mike Davis and Kendall Sheffield. Both of those are potential cap cuts. But I think, again, Davis's status is potentially tied to Cordarrelle Patterson. Sheffield's status, we'll just sort of have to see. I mentioned him on 2 free agent Fridays ago, of trading him to the Dallas as a hypothetical trade to get, third string tight end Sean McCune. So like that's going to be an option. And I'll be curious if the Falcons actually make any trades, in the coming days and or weeks for some veteran players or whatever the case may be. It would be a nice thing to see. I always get, jealous of other teams that make a bunch of trades. Trades is just, there's just something about trades that are fun to see in the NFL because they're so rare or whatever the case may be. We'll see what happens in terms of further restructures for the time being. Again, it doesn't sound like a Grady Jarrett or Jake Matthews extension is coming down the pipe, just because you would imagine that somebody out there in the media would be reporting on it. But, maybe we hear more about that over the next 72 hours and see if a deal gets done. But particularly with Grady Jarrett, and basically, again, going back to something I've already said on the podcast, those types of big money contracts typically don't, happen in a short period of time, right? It takes months and months to negotiate that. So instead, like, of thinking, okay, are we going to get a Grady Jarrett extension in the next 3 days? Maybe we have to extend our timeline to like 3 months, where the Falcons might be able to get that sort of done. And as far as Jake Matthews goes, I'm still expecting a restructure for him, and that could save a max restructure, could save about $6 million. But now that, voidable years are on the table for the Falcons based off the Matt Ryan restructure, they could tack on voidable years and potentially save up to $9 million. Right? They could do a voidable year restructure for Grady Jarrett. Like, if they can't do a max restructure of Grady Jarrett's contract because this is the final year of his contract, a typical max restructure, but they could do it with voidable years, and you could save, up to $12 million with Grady Jarrett's contract. So talking a little bit earlier about, the Falcons extending both of those guys and saving around $20 million, they could still do that, but not with extensions, but rather with restructures. So right now, again, as we kick off this big week where, news is going to be flying every single day, and certainly we'll have you updated as the week unfolds. We'll have some guests on to give their thoughts on all the things that are going on. And hopefully we'll have a free agent Friday later this week where we can actually talk about some free agent signings, unlike last year, where I think at this point in time it was like, that first Friday was basically the Lee Smith trade and the Brandon Copeland signing were like the only moves that the Falcons had made that first week of free agency. So hopefully we should certainly know something about Russell Gage, Foye Oluokun, and Cordarrelle Patterson. I would be very surprised if we do not know their status and what teams they're going to be playing for in 2022 by the time we get to Friday at this point in time. But as far as Grady Jarrett and Jake Matthews and all these other moves and whatnot, we'll just sort of have to see. So that's going to do it for us, guys, on another Mock Draft Monday. Very excited to see what unfolds this week. And obviously we'll have you covered each and every day on the Locked On Falcons podcast, which again, thank you for making it your first lesson each and every day. And of course, make sure you find it and follow it on Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, whatever your preferred podcast platform, or as on YouTube as well, where you can subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And before we duck out of here, guys, I'll give you another recommendation for what your second listen should be. And of course, why not plug the Locked On NFL Draft podcast on a Mock Draft Monday, where Ryan Tracy and Eric Crocker are also doing their Mock Draft Monday. So go check them out on the same podcast platforms that you are listening or watching Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. So guys, that's going to do it for us here. Appreciate it. Till then.